Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 18. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Michael Stumo. Michael is Chief Executive Officer of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. He has served as CEO since CPA's founding in 2007. He previously served as General Counsel for the Organization for Competitive Markets, focusing on agriculture and antitrust issues. Coalition for a Prosperous America is a national bipartisan organization representing exclusively domestic producers and workers across many industries and sectors of the U.S. economy. Michael, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. Well, Michael, as I said in the pre-show, we'd like to have our audience get to know each of our guests a bit as we jump into what can be a fairly specialized subject matter. So how is it that you went from your upbringing and education background into leading a coalition that is really at the cutting edge of, I think, a changing area of the American political landscape and trade?
Sure, Steve. Yeah, I grew up on an Iowa farm, had dairy for a while until the dairy part went broke, and then went into hogs. My dad, that is, at the time, and always corn, soybeans, hay, oats, and later corn and soybeans. And I actually raised pigs in high school and actually junior college to raise money to put me and myself through school. And so I still, even now, live on a farm now with my family in Massachusetts, in the rural western Massachusetts. But got an agriculture degree from Iowa State University, and my first job out of college was being a hog and cattle buyer for a farm organization. So I drove down the roads in a 1982 baby blue Plymouth Horizon, looking at pigs and bidding on them and trying to get them into my weighing stations where I could, the farmers would bring them in and I'd weigh them and pay them and then ship them out to the packing plant. And ended up going to law school, met my wife there. We had a family, moved out east, got a job doing lawyering, and still kept in touch with agriculture. And when I could, I did some public interest advocacy for sort of the ag version of blue collar populism, really. And then at some point later, we had a big case against Tyson IBP, which is the biggest beef packer, on antitrust and price fixing. And that was a case that ended up, jury found price fixing, an Alabama jury found big price fixing, but a federal circuit court didn't think they were right. But that's the kind of thing to protect farmers, farm incomes. And in around 2006 and 7, we were figuring out in the agriculture sector that, this trade thing isn't working out like it was supposed to. All these foreign export market access opportunities were not materializing. What was really happening is we were giving up domestic market share, and the domestic market is where we made our money. And this is a real, the math isn't adding up, but this is a big issue. We're looking for some friends and ended up getting in touch with, manufacturers, said, hey, same thing for us. And at the time, actually, some of the labor organizations were saying, hey, the same thing for us. It's we're losing domestic market share, and that international market share, they have really great numbers and promises, but it isn't working out. So we worked together and formed CPA.
Well, I love the kind of grassroots upbringing through agriculture. My granddad was raised in Nebraska. To his dying day, he said, he's just a hayseed from Nebraska, even if he retired from the Department of Interior, lived almost all of his adult life in the DC area working for the federal government, but always had a garden in the backyard, no matter how big or small the backyard was, would raise pumpkins for the county fair every year, sometimes get a blue ribbon, what have you. But I hear in you a lot of what reminds me of my grandpa of that doesn't really get out of you when you live. For me, it was reform through labor. I was sent there. I lived in a very rural part of Maryland, almost the town of 300, and we were in the suburbs. But my cousins still called me a city slicker when I'd come to their farm. But I love that. But you just got into what I think is a really fascinating intersection of trends that didn't really play well together for a long time. And that is sort of organized labor, ag, and manufacturing. I mean, these were really seemingly separate lanes. So it was interesting at that time coming together on that. Talk a little bit about what kind of prompted it. You hinted at sort of the concerns about market share, but was it an easy sell? Was it kind of a quick first date all the way to consummation that we want to work together? Or did it take a little bit of give and take to get used to the different cultures of these three different lanes?
Yeah, it took some, give and take from the agriculture side. Pretty willing to work out with everybody. And actually, some of the manufacturers, small to mid-sized manufacturers, had tried to do some reform in the National Association of Manufacturers, the big U.S. manufacturing organization. And they ended up using the voting process inside NAM, and failed. They would get some things passed, but then the board, which was controlled by multinationals, would veto it, and it wouldn't go anywhere. So they were deciding, well, we won't go here. Let's look for something else. They hadn't found it. And then labor had sort of done its fair trade thing for a while, which is mostly focused on labor and environmental rights, not so much on the trade deficit. And so mostly the industrial unions, because there's really three big sets of unions: the service workers, which aren't so trade dependent; the public employees union aren't so trade dependent, but the industrial unions, the miners, the steel workers, the auto workers are and were. And so we decided to form the organization, and getting through some things. There are a lot of strong personalities, and I had to be sort of, counselor a lot of times to sort of keep people together and keep people focused on things, uh, and it worked out. And so, but the first, so it worked out. That's what it took, and we've continued for quite a few years now.
Well, talk a little bit about this arc from the founding to where we are now, because it sure strikes me that you guys were at the front end of one of the most consequential shifts in American public policy in a long time. And you sort of use some of the words that people are much more familiar with post 2016 election. But prior to the 2016 election, when you talked about this coalition that kind of represented a form of populism, was, I think, resisting over globalization, and you're picking some pretty powerful competitors, if not enemies, among the special interests that you're up against. But if you go from 2007 to 2023, it seems like there's a lot more of America that is on side than when you started. Does it feel that way to you and your membership? And what are sort of the key points in that arc, if I've got it right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very different world now. We are very, what our view, and I call it trade and industrial strategy, which is clearly, the trend right now. And it certainly wasn't in 2007 and 2008. It was all free trade, borderless goods, borderless capital, globalization, financialization, all that. Even the financial crash, we thought, okay, they'll figure it out now. Well, they didn't. We were naive at the time. They figured out the over financialization is a bad idea. You got to have a real economy with real production, real jobs. But this free trade versus, whether it's protectionism, I call it the American system of economics, which started with Hamilton and Henry Clay, where you intentionally use tariffs and export subsidies, low-cost loans, that sort of thing, to build a country. that was how they did it from the founding to the 1930s. So this free trade versus you know, uh, whatever the name is, protectionism or industrialism or productivism or whatever you call it, is a long, long debate. It's 200 years old. And so the U.S. rejected free trade in terms of intentional development. Most other countries, every country that's developed has done that, Germany to Japan to South Korea, Taiwan, and China in its own way. Nobody's used free trade to get from poor to rich. But in the 1930s, it became a tariff cutting. I won't go through that, but until basically we had NAFTA and Ross Perot in 1993 and 4, and then China joining the WTO in 2000, and big protests around both of those. So we came in later than that. So when we were there, the Washington consensus, where both parties said, whatever you call it, neoliberal globalism is the way to go. That was what was the case, Bush 2, W. Bush, and then Obama. So at that point, we were really the shrill voice in the cheap seats. We were unique in looking at the economics rather than just the labor and environmental rights in these agreements, which classic fair traders did. And we didn't have a very good audience for a while. But
one of the things that stuck out most to me in this timeline was in 2016 at both national conventions. You had signs. So that means that no small number of delegates at both Republican and Democrat conventions wanted to have the anti-TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership signs. And we have some pretty significant allies in Asia that were frosty about this trend. But this was the moment where I thought, well, my goodness, not only did I see on the Republican side this big shift of grassroots populism coming up and in some ways challenging, if not overtaking, establishment thinking, but then on the Democrat side, where in the 1990s, a lot of the opposition to most favored nation status for China and advocacy for human rights usually came more from Democrats than Republicans during that time. And it was 2016 at these national conventions that you could see both of those delegate audiences rattling like that. You just knew something had shifted, and really neither party had figured out how to grapple with it yet, in my estimation, at that moment. But that seemed to me to be the ride you guys were on for a long while. And also, I think what made CPA and that coalition different was it really wasn't about right or left. It was really about grassroots up and doing right by Americans, American industry, American farmers, basically from the bottom up. And so, correct me if I'm wrong in simplifying it in that way. But that was a concept that was way ahead of its time. It's still resisted now. But it sure does seem like since 2016, a better audience, and seemingly on both sides. Before we shift to talk a little bit more about China, after all, it is the China Desk podcast, so we'll do some of that. Talk to me a little bit about how you see things as having changed from that 2016 till now. We have some different committees, a couple of select committees that are relevant in the House. Some things might have changed a little in the Senate, seems a little less so to me in that regard, but definitely a different national conversation. So as you've approached this from going as sort of the skunk at the garden party earlier on, how does the lay of the land look to you, and where are the big areas of opportunity?
Yeah, I'll hit 2 points before 2016. So between our founding, we had 2011 when we had votes during the Obama years, and Michael Froman was U.S. Trade Representative, Wall Street type, and they pushed the South Korea, the Peru, and Colombia. And there were 3 trade agreements then, and it was really the Dems were split. And all Republicans voted for them except for 8 or 9 at that time. So, yes, the Democrats were more favorable to this sort of blue collar approach to trade then. Then the TPP came up, Trans-Pacific Partnership and Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, which
Right.
went from Obama. You had Obamacare with the healthcare, but it was labeled Obama Trade. And the Freedom Caucus was against it. There was some presidential power things, and we actually worked with the Tea Party very closely to point out all the sovereignty problems, not only the economic, and worked very hard. And we had at a point up to 85 House Republicans against it, and that was almost 10 times against what was the Korea agreements.
Mm-hmm.
And the left was working its thing, but we worked with the right, the right and the sovereignty concerns as long as our economic. And the first vote of TPA, Boehner was speaker and Paul Ryan was chair of Ways and Means, and they lost the first vote. And then they did a parliamentary maneuver, won the next vote, and then it went through. But that was a big watershed. And then Hillary had to disown it. Bernie was hammering her in the 2015, 16 campaign. She had to disown it. We had really helped ramp things up, and we were a big part of it. And then, of course, Trump, who had been pro-tariff, pro-economic nationalism since the 80s, with calling for tariffs on Japan during Japan Inc., got in. And then he came in, and we helped him and Lighthizer. One of our board members helped the transition team. Dan D'Amico of Nucor had fought the Chinese for years in steel. Lighthizer had done the same. He got in, and they started doing 232 national security tariffs, 301 China tariffs, and the only one defending them were us.
Yeah. Well, that's a big, big change. Bob Lighthizer is a friend. He's a colleague at the America First Policy Institute also. Probably one of the most consequential cabinet members in terms of a real consequential pivot point in where the rubber meets the road, not just in American politics and policy, but just what role America is seeking to play and trying to reset some of these terms of engagement that seem to have just kind of run as a headless horseman for a generation or so. So that was truly a different circumstance. I trust you met with a relatively open door policy at USTR with the priorities that CPA had. With a change of environment like that, might have been unfamiliar territory compared to years past.
Yeah, it certainly was. We weren't terribly welcome in the Michael Froman U.S. Trade Representative's office, more so here. But even then, Bob really had his way of doing things. He's a very smart fellow, very politically savvy, and they hit on the national security aspects, which the GOP in the Senate and the House, to the extent they are free trade supporters, which they were at that time as the ground was shifting and under them, and they're still there, a lot of them. Where you don't care where things are made, just so it's cheap, don't care where it's made. Cheap consumption rather than strong production. That's really the hinge point. But national security is more important. So they hit the 232 national security tariffs and then the 301. I mean, everyone thought China engagement was a great thing in 2015, right? In 2016 and 2017. He's an isolationist, but they did that huge, there's a 301 intellectual property theft report that was very well documented. Nobody has ever said that's wrong. They always try to distract. It was never challenged in and of itself, and it still has legs. And then, of course, General Secretary Xi since then has made it quite clear that he's engagement. He's gone from hide and bide, as you know, to what he is now. So he sort of took it from there. But we put out economic reports and everything, how the economy isn't going to crash, inflation won't be a problem. There's going to be growth from this. We're going to reshore, and that's what happened. But you had the globalists, the Peterson Institute, the Economist magazine, everyone shrieking, the New York Times, and the anxiety-ridden apocalyptic claims were quite something, and they didn't occur. And then we came to COVID, and we see that supply chains matter, having production matters. 72 countries had export controls, properly holding critical goods for their own citizens, which is their sovereign right and duty. And that you got to, do this. And then you've got to do it right. And then, of course, the Ukraine-Russia war, another was supply chain. So we had Trump come in, we had the populists move his way. They're fighting over the blue collar populists. They're moving toward the Republicans. And then you're getting mugged by reality with the supply chain stuff and the national security goods and da 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 da. And here we are.
Yeah, well, I really, really agree with the mugged by reality point where you put it. And in all of our discussions about China policy, it ends up with some point along the way where someone's got to get mugged that way. And it just definitely does change the way you think about what your policy options are. And I also think that Xi Jinping has proven to be a blessing and a curse. He's, of course, a curse because he's an evil man doing evil things. But he's a blessing in the sense that he does the quiet part out loud. And it makes it so that people really can't deny that they're doing what they're doing. For most of my career, we'd have American expert intermediaries that would mansplain what China really was doing and try to make it so you don't believe your eyes, don't believe your ears. Let me tell you that everything is going okay and it's all going to be fine. And now I think COVID really was one of those pivot points. And I think you're right in terms of the supply chains finally getting into people's minds where they needed to be. But isn't that interesting? That's a very different basket of priorities than when the coalition was founded. If I remember the way a lot of these conversations were taking place, whether it was just on China and the econ team, we would have basically Treasury Department led strategic economic dialogues, which would be heavily Wall Street focused kind of things with very clear Chamber of Commerce talking points. And so the issues related to workers, much less trade imbalances, oh, those are things that are for chalkboards and you change assumptions and graphs and they all go away. It's a different PowerPoint presentation away. But COVID, I think, really was a wake-up call. I also think you're exactly right about it being a wake-up call for American leaders to see, well, wait a minute, other countries are doing some of these things, and they're the right thing to do. And these tools are here for a reason. So it gives us a very different set today. So with that set, let's dive a little bit more into the China-specific areas, because I know the coalition has done some pretty important spade work on a few areas of China policy where things are moving on the Hill and other areas generally. But what would you put up there as kind of your top couple of China policy priorities, and how would you describe how they're going right now?
Well, our priorities are very big and they're not being implemented right now, and I can talk about that. But you need, in our view, a combination of exchange rate reform, which is something that's very hard to understand and nobody's talking about, but it's really, if I were king, it's the holy grail for rebalancing things. It's actually small government industrial policy, exchange rate management. But Treasury, the Fed, Wall Street, don't agree. And we have an insane strong dollar policy, which no other country in the world has a strong currency policy that makes in order to grow their economy. So it's kind of weird, but I get it. Then on industrial strategy, you need a combination of tariffs and industrial subsidies. So tariffs can do a lot. Sometimes they've been targeted. People have small yard, high fence kind of things. I don't buy into that much. In many ways, you need to be broader, but certainly, we would have broad tariffs, and the president in his current campaign has called for, President Trump, that is, has called for universal tariffs all the way around. We're just releasing a report on how pro-growth that is. It's on our website right now, a different version of it. So tariffs, if it was me and us, we would have tariffs to raise revenue. The 301 China tariffs are raising $50 billion a year revenue, which is as much as the gas tax. Mm-hmm. If we had China most favored nation status reformed and put them in our non-MFN trade category, we've estimated another $200 billion in revenue per year, which gets to almost what corporate income tax revenue is. It's around 300. It hits a low of 225 billion, something like that. 250 to 400, and then use some of that money to boost up industries that we really want to have, the pharma, whatever. Give them a boost. Some things, if we decide we just absolutely can't lose it, like, key defense sectors, but maybe biotech, AI, whatever you want to choose. But there's some that you got to have the suppliers upstream to do it. Do some subsidies there, but put the tariff walls up, because look, you cannot have a high wage society um, while being thrown in direct competition with several billion low wage workers. You need some insulation, and that's what the tariffs are and the subsidies. Otherwise, you'll just blend all the global labor rates into one, and we'll be unhappy, and India and China will be happy. And that's why you have a lot of problems here with, people pretty upset with how things have been. So exchange rate management to get a currency, the strong dollar, down to a trade balancing price. And that's a little ways away, but Bob Lighthizer agrees with that, but he understands it's not going to happen next week. Tariffs and then industrial subsidies put together. And that's a revenue neutral kind of a situation. You get new revenue from tariffs, where you get money from people that are bringing things in, and then you're spurring what we have, and you get to scale. You get economies of scale, scope, new innovation. You take a lot of labor out with automation, and that's why you didn't get inflation for the 301 tariffs, because people got to scale here. We can actually do a really good job with most things, except maybe cut and sew fabrics. Mm-hmm. So, but the 201 tariffs on solar, there were safeguard tariffs under Trump for solar and clothes washers. They spurred a bunch of investment in those items without inflation, and prices kept falling for consumers. 232 tariffs for steel. After a year of volatility, steel prices came down to the way they were pre-tariff, because our industry invested another $22 billion. It's hard to figure out what that means. It's a lot. It's a huge amount of new capacity. Very efficient, very clean. And so we never saw inflation from steel tariffs. And the International Trade Commission confirms this. They just did a March report. We didn't see it. And then China 301s, the consumer never saw the inflation. You had to have China or the importers cut margins, or else the big stateless multinationals bringing it in had to cut their margins.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a couple of terms that get thrown around a lot that seem to hit right dead center into the issues that CPA is advocating for. I imagine I know what the answer is to these things, but there are decoupling, de-risking, divesting. But do you think that Americans broadly, the business community, others, are ready for these kinds of bold strokes, given that we have been deeply entrenched in this habit for a long time, very high on the sugar promises of the old way of doing things? And we get a lot of scare rhetoric from the White House and the big newspapers and others that we can't afford to do these kinds of things. But how would you reframe or recast this discussion about decoupling, de-risking, divesting, what have you?
Well, one, we're doing it now, and exports from China to here are down a lot, and China is, sort of digging its own grave in a way. So we're doing it now. The president's actions did start it. Look, the chattering class, the laptop class, they're not ready. The voters are. There's just a poll released yesterday by Reuters Ipsos that showed 66% of Americans want to increase tariffs on China right now. So the voters are ready for it. And they would vote for a candidate. It would make a positive difference for them choosing a presidential candidate if that candidate wanted to raise tariffs on China. So they get it. And I represent some farmers, even during the 301 tariff, farmers and ranchers, cattle ranchers, and they were supportive. They said, yeah, we get it. And Trump did take some of the new revenue from the China tariffs and compensated farmers for the delta of what they lost. 12 billion one year, 13 billion another year, and then settle out no more. But we're getting 50 billion a year out of it. So net, it's a nice revenue source for the U.S. government. So the voters are there. But right now, you got to do it. China, look, we do it, and that's how we won the Cold War in the Soviet Union. We decoupled, or didn't fully couple with them, and to the extent we were coupled in Europe was Reagan decoupled. He cut off trade. He cut off capital market flows. they couldn't borrow in dollars, and he caused the oil price to decline by deregulating the wellhead, convincing the Saudis to pump 2 million barrels a day more oil, because every dollar less in oil was 1 billion off of Soviet revenue, which was a total of either 16 or 32 billion a year. So it was big. And they ended up throwing in the towel because they ran out of money, couldn't support the satellite states. They threw in the towel. Now, of course, they're back in a different form. China's bigger, but they don't have internal consumption to drive their growth. They're too poor internally. The real estate has crashed. Their infrastructure building has run its course. They're too much overridden with debt, and all they have is exports. And now that's crashing. And so they could be in a tipping point and go into their lost decade like Japan now. But there's a big world out there. We got a lot of production we can do here. It is pro-growth to produce a lot more ourselves, because a nation is great not because of what it consumes, but by what it produces. And to the extent you can't, let third countries do it. I don't call them allies. I call them fair weather friends. But regardless, that's the way I see it. I think the country's ready. And I think it's like the iPhone. I mean, it's like Trump came in and he said things that the chattering class thought was wrong, but he got the vote. And I think it's still ready right now, even more so.
Well, talk a little bit about some of the different ways the coalition that you lead has been affected by unfair trade or other kinds of measures, because what disadvantages manufacturers might be different from farmers. I mean, everyone's affected by energy. I think everyone's also affected by processing. And there's a massive issue of, even if we extract, grow, manufacture here, there's still a lot of inputs and processing that we offshore. That just seems to be just a massive area. Perhaps the coalition has overlapping Venn diagrams on, but maybe there's areas of where different parts of the coalition have been affected that the average person in our audience wouldn't readily think of. But are there parts of the family that have been dramatically affected differently?
Well, sure. Manufacturing, I mean, it depends on the country. Agriculture, people think, is a big net exporter, and they're really not. Corn and soybeans are, maybe wheat, maybe barley, but the rest of it's not. It's more, and then poultry. But that's actually what people think about. But you've got produce, nuts, seafood. So on average, ag is a net zero. They're not a big importer. And so cattle is, it's not China, it's actually Canada and Mexico, just flooding our market, taking out our cattle ranchers. And so they have a big problem actually with NAFTA and USMCA. Same with produce, fruit, vegetables, a lot coming in from Mexico. Where pre-NAFTA, pre-US, they were doing a lot better. So they lost a lot of market share in that way, and it's taken a big toll and made rural communities poorer, more desperate, more drugs, more crime, more broken families. For manufacturing, it tends to be China, but you do have some differences. And in agriculture, where the tension could seem to be is, as you saw during the Trump years with the China 301 tariffs, they allegedly and did in some ways cut off agricultural imports from the U.S., and they are a big buyer of our stuff. But that's like what we saw with the steel tariffs. You had a volatility for 2 years in price, and it came back down. That's documented. The government has documented that. You had the same thing in agriculture. The world's stomach didn't change because its trade diverted from China. Brazil sold more to China. We sold more to Europe. And ag kind of recovered because you rewired the system a bit. Plus, during that time, 1/2 of China's pigs died from the swine flu. China has half the pigs in the world anyway, so 25% of the pigs in the world died. And that was one reason they didn't buy so much corn and soy. But you do have, and then you have some, Mexico is more of an auto parts issue. We get most of our auto parts from there. Actually, right now, with China exports to the U.S. declining, Mexico is our biggest trading, counterparty right now. I don't say trade partner because there is an inherent rivalry in there, so I don't like that word. So there are those differences, but overall, we've held it together that we want to produce more in this country.
Yeah. Well, there's, I think, also a real curiosity about what messages really seem to be getting through to move people? Because not everyone is going to be like you or me and happy to talk about tariff rates or some three-digit number that refers to a process here or there. But one of the concepts we've talked about a lot on this podcast is a policy of reciprocity, that people can kind of inherently understand that what China prohibits our people being able to do in their country, we should prohibit them doing that in our country. And that's been at the intersection of China and ag land in the United States. And it's a principle that could apply more broadly. Maybe it doesn't work 100% of the time, but it's something that people seem to think for a moment, yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. If we can't do that there, we shouldn't allow them to have access here. But does that sort of making a priority of reciprocity in your experience work to open minds and open doors, or are there other areas or other kinds of conversation starters that have really pushed this in a more constructive direction for you?
Sure. It depends a lot on the audience, of course. Um, in that you have left and right audiences value different things. So from the right, the national security tends to be, especially the older line conservatives, where national security has always been, and the new blue collar conservatives too. So that China's the big driver of everything right now. We need to win against China. Reciprocity does work in many cases. I have personally, and I'm not necessarily the target audience there, a little bit of difficulty with it because the globalists have used reciprocity for a while in these trade agreements. They'll do things, we do things. It's a very lawyerly, it looks the same on paper, but it never translates to the ground. Reciprocal tariff cuts, it always ended up we're the biggest importer anyway. They overproduce and we absorb their overcapacity and take out our employment. So it's a bit too lawyerly for the end game for me, but I get it as an argument. We had reciprocity with food safety regs where they couldn't, they could ship in beef and pork and seafood, and they would have harmonized reciprocal food safety rules to us, but it was just on paper, and they would, it was they imported shrimp, and there's a lot of problems with some of this imported food that would never make it through here. Same with pharmaceuticals from India, generic drugs. They claim to have an Indian equivalent of FDA, the same. So reciprocity and the market access sounds good, but it's lawyerly and it never turned out. So I have a little hiccup with that. The environmental side is big on the left in that if China's the biggest driver of CO2 type emissions in the world. They put up two coal plants every week in December 2022, while Biden thinks engagement in China as a partner on climate change and CO2 emissions. It's clearly to me ridiculous. And but our consumption of Chinese goods is driving it, and also we're shipping it with very highly polluting cargo ships across the Pacific, some of which pollute like several thousand cars all at once. So, there's that part, the pro worker part, which the administration is using, and just pro growth. I mean, showing that tariffs and industrial strategy is a way to grow the economy. And if you gut yourself with cheap consumption from anywhere and you end up with a financial economy plus tourism plus home health care and restaurants, that's not a good economy. So
Yeah.
I think it depends on the audience.
Yeah, well, I remember back in the early MFN debates, post Tiananmen Square, the change in the Clinton administration from butchers of Beijing to seeking a different approach to human rights and trade for the latter two-thirds or more of the administration. You still had a pretty robust conversation about human rights. And even though MFN inherently was about kind of tariff rate schedules at its core, a lot of the policy and political debate was in this other area. These days, we have a Uyghur forced labor bill that has passed, and there's questions of how do we kind of name and shame people or push people to comply or what have you. But in this kind of new environment on public policy, trade, and politics with China, where do the kind of human rights issues fall in from tech? And, are they snooping on us, or are we part of prison labor and things like that?
So forced labor has long been in trade law since the 1930s. It's always been a fig leaf. They throw a lot of fig leaves in to cover up, to have to put some nice, lipstick on a pig, to change metaphors for a moment. And so since the 1930s, it's been unlawful to import goods made in whole or in part with forced labor into the U.S. And it's never been enforced. Maybe a here and there, but if you did, oh my gosh, you were a protectionist. And is there really forced labor there? And so the Uyghur genocide, now that the Trump administration and the Biden administration both have acknowledged that's there, and et cetera. We did have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which upped that prior 1930s law. They are doing something with it, insufficient in my view, but certainly more than before. And so it has and had the potential. And it's a big deal. Earl Blumenauer, the ranking member on House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, big climate guy, talks about climate all the time, and importing Chinese solar panels. He said, I want to save the climate, but not on the back of forced labor. So in his mind, forced labor is more important than climate. We need to do it another way. So it's become a lot more powerful than the fig leaf it has been, and it will become more powerful.
Well, it's an important shift. I just feel like the broad trend lines are moving in the direction that they should, not as fast as they should. Never seems to be really the case that they're moving as fast as they should. And sort of the terms of the debate move around an awful lot. For most of the last administration, it really was on tariffs and trade deals and things like that. It just feels like there's a bit more to the conversation now, perhaps because Xi Jinping has so openly squashed Hong Kong, has so blatantly threatened Taiwan, and pretty much is out there rubbing shoulders with Putin and making it clear that there's a different approach to the world and the human race that is out there that a lot of our experts had tried to push into the background. But this strikes me as a conversation that we could have over and over, Michael, if you're willing to do so. But I want to thank you for joining today. And before we move into our outro, for those in the audience who want to follow your commentary and the activities and research of the coalition, where should they go?
Sure. Our website is ProsperousAmerica.org, and we have an economics team doing research on how industrial strategy and tariffs can grow the economy. We have a lot of commentary and positions and news on everything we just discussed today, from national security to the steel industry to forks and knives to all kinds of things, because we do have members in many industrial sectors. And so that's where you go, ProsperousAmerica.org.
Outstanding. Well, if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Michael Stumo for sharing his outstanding perspective. Till next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.